I'll reach out to you.
My ears open. Thank you very much.
I got a phone call from one of our Rural Advisory Committee fishing guide this week who wasn't able to participate today because he's guiding right now, naturally. He wanted to get his input in, and I'll just quickly summarize his 3 points. The pass-through zone concept, he said, was logical and addresses the problems without collateral damage to other user groups. He indicated that the large slow no wake zone concept would limit any commercial activity, including fishing guides. And also, as has been mentioned by Andy and by others, he's seen a major increase in wake-style boat use in 2020 in the whole lower river, attributed to potentially or probably COVID, but also from regulations put in place in the upper river. And if you indulge me real quick, just one thing, just a kind of a staff, something that we've noticed over the last few weeks. We're hearing a whole lot of conflicts associated with wake-style boats in other areas, not in the lower Willamette Valley. At the next board meeting, you can expect to hear no less than 3 petitions to limit wake-style boats in certain areas. Only one of those areas is even in the Willamette Valley. The other 2 are, I guess, what we call Eastern Oregon. And the thought behind that is that as there's more regulations, more difficulties for these watercraft to recreate in the Willamette River, the lower Willamette Valley, the boats are going further and further away and causing conflicts where there never were conflicts before. So it's just something, as we consider zones going forward, I think it's something that the board should keep in mind that, we have seen this, that zones do move conflicts around, but they may not necessarily solve them statewide. And that's all I got. I'll get out of your way and let you have your discussion.
Okay, so would I don't see from any of the board members, but if the board members would like to make some comments, I can't see Vince's picture anymore. So if Vince, if you want to raise your hand, then just speak up. I see you now, but Craig, you've got your hand up. We will start with you. Make sure you unmute.
This is Member Whitney. I'd like to ask Andy if he thinks allocate aid time on the river to different user groups would help address the conflicts that we currently have. For example, non-motorized boaters are primarily using the river probably in the morning hours, while wakeboarders are using it in the afternoon or evening. So if we allowed those time slots to them, would that help alleviate the problem on the river?
Andy, if you unmute yourself, you can answer.
Yes, time slots is a very interesting concept. I think it'd be worth considering. I don't. It's true, non-motorized craft are usually out more in the morning, and in the afternoon, kind of everybody's out. Maybe even at different days, alternating days. I really want that. I really want that. Interesting concept.
Okay, thank you. Craig, did you?
Motorized boats out there on a kayak are pretty obvious.
Craig, did you have
Can I ask
anything?
that question?
Go ahead. Follow up on that. Yes, please.
Can we ask the question of Paige also?
The same question?
Yes, please.
Oh, hi. Thanks. Yeah, that was one that we talked about that in our rule committee. Like you just said, I think that was a good observation. I think there is already kind of a natural division of activities by time. And I know for myself, and having road crew and stuff, we always got up super early to row because with the sculls being as fragile as they are, that was like the only time before any kind of boat traffic. And this was 35 years ago. The only time that between weather with waves and traffic that it was safe to do that. So most of our coalition members who who paddle either go out early if they're seeking those conditions. And so I think by doing that, I hate to impose rules on people and tell them they can't go out at certain times, but I think there's already that ability to choose to go out based on your skill set, the conditions you want. And we actually meet a lot of paddlers now who like being out with different user groups. I have some video of some people with outriggers who they kind of indicate to us sometimes they're going to do this to, I think, so we're not wondering why they're getting so close to us, that they'll come up alongside us on the side of the river and come out a little bit to the middle just to our wake and want to ride at the wakes. And we talked to yesterday, there were stand-up paddleboarders doing that. But I can also tell that they're pretty skilled because they also still kind of stay to the side. Like they come out to ride a little bit and they go back. I don't see them in the middle of the river just sitting there like I do with a lot of beginner paddlers where it really is blocking things. And so, I mean, I think that could be part of education, which is just helping people understand based on what you're looking for and what your skill set is. Like, these are the better times to go out. I know there was a river guide that the Marine Board and state parks put out some years ago, which described the river, this stretch of the Willamette, most of the Willamette, as being best for motorboats and jet-driven craft, and that for paddlers, you know, they were allowed that in non-congested areas. So there could be an updated version of that that also talked about, hey, these are the best areas for paddlers. Unless you know your skill set and you like being out in those ways, this is where you should go. These are the best times. That helps people make those decisions. But I think, you know, I saw Larry Warren's comment about some of the increase in paddler deaths this year has been probably partially due to inadequate skill set on the river. So I think educating people about the best time to go out is better than telling people when they can go out. Because what about the paddlers who like being out with motorboats? So I get the idea, but I don't think it needs to come to that.
Thank you, Paige. I know from Craig, just from a fishing guide standpoint, you know, we're probably some of the only power boats that are out there around the same time as some of the paddlers would be. Early mornings are when, you know, generally you will launch and take off and head to where you need to be. So some kind of a temporal solution, time restriction, days to restriction could have an impact on commercial type activities also. Just a few thoughts. Oh, okay, is your hand thing not working, Colleen? You have a question?
No, sadly, it is not working.
Okay.
I have to do with the computer I'm on, but that's okay. I'm hearing a lot about rules and folks following or not following them. What is the actual feasibility for enforcement of any rule that we put in? We all know that law enforcement is very strapped for resources on a good day. I can't imagine that they're doing any better during this current time. So what is the feasibility of enforcing any rules that we put in? And also, and I know Josh had asked this question before, but the Coast Guard, have they weighed in at all on their opinions of rules on a commercially navigable waterway?
Member Moran, I'll answer the second part of your question first. No, to this point, they still have not. And full disclosure for the rest of the board members, we have sought Coast Guard input into the different regulatory proposals that have been kind of flying around this process over the last 6 months. But to this point, I don't have any input from anyone from the Coast Guard regarding what they might support and what they might potentially claim preemption over. To the first part of your question, as far as law enforcement feasibility, I may not be the best one to answer this, but I'll give it a shot. I mean, all the proposals that we're talking about right now are independent of any kind of increase in resources for law enforcement. Multnomah County Marine Patrol, potentially more than any other county, is very, very strapped. There's a whole lot of, 80 miles of river that they try to cover with their group. And there's also many non-boating related issues that they are dealing with. When I was addressing the Rural Advisory Committee very early on in the process, I prefaced the conversation with, none of this means additional, it comes with a guarantee of additional enforcement or additional compliance. It doesn't necessarily mean that new regulations aren't needed or necessary or what have you. But we may not have more, we likely will not have more enforcement for any new rules that we put in place. And I think that's something that the board members should consider as they consider potential new regulations.
And I see that Randy is still on the line. Randy, would you, jump in on that law enforcement question?
Sure, Chair Early, members of the board. Josh got it right. We're at a time where just during sort of the evolution of recreational voting over the last, really the last 20 years, declines in registration, fee structures, fuel tax. It feels like voters are paying more, but that doesn't translate into significantly increased dollars to law enforcement. So we've seen their kind of that buying power erode over the last 6 or 7 years. The last couple of years, it's been pretty much flat. It'll be, single percentage points increase for next year. We are trying to figure out ways to move resources around a little bit more through special emphasis patrols and things like that. But I gotta tell you, there's so many variables out there. This year, obviously, Multnomah County Marine officers are also police officers, and they get pulled to other priority things, and there's priorities in Portland right now. They are having a hard time recruiting. I mean, even despite funds, we have programs that can't hire officers. They just can't. It's very frustrating. I'm extremely frustrated. We have some programs that are able to attract retirees and get good seasonal help, and other programs that just can't. I mean, retirees don't go to Hood River to settle down, it's just too expensive. And other full-time programs have their own limitations. So while I would love to say we have some flexibility, I'm getting frustrated and feeling like we don't have that kind of flexibility. So we have to more than ever consider about how enforceable the rules are. And I will tell you that I'm committed to trying to find flexible ways to apply those resources. We have those discussions going all the time.
Thank you, Randy. And Member Whitney, Craig, you've got your hand up. And then Laura.
I'd like to ask Randy about the education side of it. We keep hearing that education helped a great deal in this lower Willamette. And we've had experience in applying education tools in other locations. Would they make a substantial difference here in your view?
What we've seen, Charlie, education makes a difference, there is no doubt. It is a long-term solution, not a short-term solution. If we take a statutory response to require education for non-motorized boats. And so you're looking at 2 to 3 years out before we do that, if we could get it through anyway. I think it would be, from an enforcement standpoint, it's a double-edged sword with all of the, you can just look at the fatalities this year and see a lot of people who grabbed a boat in a hurry and went out and weren't adequately prepared. Not because they're bad people, but because they just didn't know what they didn't know. And they got into trouble. And we're seeing that statewide in numerous situations. The education piece would help with that. It would also create an interesting roadblock or impediment, I guess, because people tend to look at non-motorized boating as a very easy way to get to the water. It's low cost, it's affordable, it's nearby, all that kind of stuff. So yes, I think education would be great. Requirement for non-motorized. I think we can personally like the idea of the towed water, statewide towed water sports, some additional education there. I think that would help to continue that conversation. And that's about all I can say, because beyond that, it becomes a policy issue with bigger political discussions to be had.
Thank you, Randy. Laura, you have your hand up, and then Vince.
Great, thank you. I think my question is probably targeted towards Ms. Stoyer. You talked about things that you've observed, unsafe operation by non-motorized boaters, stand-up paddleboarders hanging out in the middle of the river, stuff like that. When I started paddling, we didn't have places like Alder Creek. We didn't have formalized education. You learned from a mentor. You learned from somebody who was a waterman. As a waterman yourself, do you ever actually go to some of these people and say, hey, do you understand that what you're doing is unsafe, or there's a safer way to do what you're doing, or the rules say blah, blah, blah about operating on the right side of the river and things like that? Do people in your coalition actually try to mentor some of these people?
Yeah, it's funny you ask that. We actually do, and I think people on the boat with me get tired of saying, hey, let's go talk to us, guys. I think in particular, if I see kids, being a mom, there were 2 teenagers under the railroad crossing before LO and stand-up paddleboards with no vest and with no boats even around them. They were having trouble with their balance, and I had just seen a lot of boats go through, and so I made my boyfriend take me over there to talk to them, and I just explained, like, you know, first you have to have life vests on and you know, this is just, I can tell you're learning, this is not a good place to be. And they were super appreciative and receptive, and sometimes that's the response I get. Sometimes people get angry with me. I've talked to law enforcement about it as well, because they often will try to help and guide those paddlers doing that, and they said they often get a lot of pushback. People get really angry with them for trying to advise them. One of the things we have thought of earlier, and I am happy to continue to do that and have other people help, but I think coming from the paddling community would be great too, from the places they buy them, rent them. We've been trying to create a safety video with all these different user groups that we could help promote, talking about it, making everyone feel like they have a voice in the video, but also they, you know, can kind of come together as a river community. Instead of talking about this user group versus this user group, I would love for everyone to be part of the same river community, and we look out for each other. You know, we're more, and I feel like we're losing that, as it's kind of like this us against them thing, which is too bad. And I think it increases user confidence and keeps us away from that place where we could help each other out more.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Vince?
Yes, my question was back to Mr. Henry.
He's still there. Go ahead.
Okay, I was just, so as part of the waterway access permit, does any of that funding, and I'm not sure how much, does any of that go towards law enforcement, or is it not earmarked for that?
Was that directed towards me?
Yes.
Or was that cut out?
No.
Or anybody that can access, because, you know,
Yeah.
about lack of resources or lack of funding, is any of the waterway access permit, is there any of that funding, you know, earmarked for law enforcement? Seeing that non-motorized is becoming more and more popular to help out with, you know, with enforcement? Or is that not?
No, it is not. That was a discussion. Yeah, that was a discussion at certainly the committee level, and
Yeah.
the determination was that this would benefit facility access and education, but specifically not law enforcement.
Okay, and that's kind of what I thought, and there's no way of changing that. You would think that it seems like the cry is not enough law enforcement, not enough enforcement, and so trying to find, you know, funding for that seems like would be a great way, you know, a great opportunity for the non-motorized to have a hand in that, since there are a large group that would like more enforcement. So
Right.
I don't know how that works, and with but that would be something to discuss.
Randy, I'll jump in on that one, if you don't mind. Randy?
Either.
Okay. So, you know, just as a reminder, the board had quite a long run all the way back to 1982 of trying to help make sure the community came in and was a part of the Marine Board and how the services were offered. And so, you know, the focus on the grants was a piece that we found everybody could agree on. And interestingly, throughout session, there was a lot of the non-motorized community in Portland was actually starting to voice that they would have been interested in having some of that money go for law enforcement. But that is not necessarily a belief that's held all across the state. And so is just trying to engage that community in a positive way. I think that's part of why it was framed the way that it was. In fact, I know that's why it was framed without that law enforcement piece. Your question about can we change it? So we would be too late for the 21 session. So the soonest the board could put forward something would be 2023. Believe it or not, that's how government works. But there was some conversations during the session about, if this came from the community ever, sure, the Marine Board would help support that and go for that. And quite honestly, it would probably work a lot better through the legislative process if the non-motorized community was there at the table asking for what would essentially amount to an increase to a fee that's already pretty brand new. So a lot of political issues to kind of move through that type of concept. I wanted to circle back real quick to the education, and Member Jackson kind of alluded to it to some degree, I think. One of the things I think as we go down with the non-motorized community, I don't want to always see the agency go back and try to recreate exactly what we've done with the motorized community. It may or may not be the right approach. And on education, when you read all the studies and the surveys and the data, most paddlers get their intro from a mentor or a paddling club. I think all paddling clubs have a safety officer. So there may be some opportunities outside of legislation that if the Marine Board had a message that we wanted to work with the paddling clubs, for instance, you've got members of the paddling club, you've got board members of paddling clubs that are here talking today. And so I think all hope is not lost, and we don't need to sit around and wait for legislation to work on that. It could be an informal work with the paddling clubs in the Portland area particularly. So there is work that could be done there.
Any other?
No, I'm getting the buzzer from Chair Early over here.
No, that's fine. Okay, Vince, did you have a final comment here?
No, that was it. That answered my question. Thank you.
Okay, well, you were waving. So, and Laura, you still have your hand up. Did you have another comment?
Actually, I did. This is, Director Warren or Josh, you can tell me to shut up if you want. Or Charlie can tell me to shut up too, but having spent very many years sitting on the committee that created what ultimately became the waterway access permit, very early on, the folks that were in that organization from the Portland metro area wanted to see a law enforcement piece, and in the initial attempt to get it passed, there was a law enforcement piece. It became a bit of kind of an urban versus rural divide amongst the boating community. And so when it went up for the second time for approval, everybody could agree on facilities. And so that's kind of facilities and education, and that's kind of where it landed. But I know from my own perspective and the perspective of a couple of the folks on that committee who are mostly urban area voters, there was a real strong message that investing in facilities in Portland isn't going to work out unless we actually have some law enforcement to help enforce the safety rules.
I remember that too, Laura, from when we first proposed it, and it failed in the legislature and then went back again, and that was the part that was agreed upon. So your point is well taken. So we definitely wanted to see more law enforcement, but it was something that not everybody could agree on to be able to get some kind of bill passed. So did any other board members have any other comments or more discussion points? If not, then I think that we're going to go ahead and take a break right now, and you have one more comment? Okay, I see Laura, and is Colleen still in here? Colleen, there she is, okay, and I see Craig and I see Vince. Welcome back. And so the second half of our work session is going to focus on the North-South Twin Lake Boaters with Disabilities discussion, and Dorothy Deal is here and going to lead us in that discussion.
All right, thank you, Chair Early, members of the board. For the record, I'm Dorothy Deal, Policy Program Coordinator for the Marine Board. The topic of this next conversation centers on boaters with physical challenges and options the agency may have to enrich their boating experience. The motivation for this discussion is based largely on a petition that the board accepted in January to consider an electric motor exemption on North and South Twin Lakes. The petitioner stated that the reason for the request was to provide a way for people with physical challenges to access and enjoy these lakes. It was similar to a petition that the board accepted last year to allow electric motors on Gold Lake. In this case, the board asked staff to explore opportunities to provide the electric motor exemption specifically to boaters with physical challenges. Before we get into the details of what these exemptions could potentially look like, we thought it would be valuable to provide a bit of background on the Marine Board's interaction with the Americans with Disabilities Act and some proactive collaboration that has taken place with boaters with disabilities. So Janine Balek will provide an overview of the topic as it relates to the facilities program, and then she'll hand it back to me for our electric motor conversation.
It takes us a minute to be able to social distance and change places, so.
So Jennifer, are you operating it? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So for the record, I'm Janine Balek. I'm our boating facilities program manager. And I kind of wanted to give you an idea of what we are doing that in many cases is above what is required for accessibility. So to give a little background, in 2002, the U.S. Access Board published ADA accessibility guidelines for recreational facilities, of which boating was a part. And then in 2010, the DOJ adopted those as ADA standards, and they became effective in 2012. So even though we did not have to do this as early as we did, as soon as those guidelines were published back in 2002, we began implementing that in all the facilities that were brought to the board for grant funding. So, go ahead. So what I wanted to highlight were some things that we're doing above, and some of them you'll think are kind of interesting. So as an example, ADA does not require accessible boat trailer parking stalls. Well, because we are the boating agency, we have made that part of our standard. So I've chosen a couple areas where you can see a lot of single cars and trailers, and there is a significant amount of accessible parking spaces, as well as the route to get to the restroom and then also to the top of the boat ramp. And then the one with the vault toilet, you see the concrete pad, technically compacted gravel can be accessible. But we know gravel parking is hard to maintain. So when we build a vault toilet, we make sure that there is an accessible concrete pad for parking so that that space is always accessible to get into the restroom. So that's something we've done above what was required because we want to make sure that it doesn't become a maintenance issue to maintain that accessibility. And then kind of also along the lines with parking, we also make the stalls longer and wider. That's not a requirement, but we have heard from boaters that it enhances their accessibility into those stalls by having some extra length and width within them. So the routes, the upper left picture has an accessible route striped through the parking area. There's some steps. But then there's also two ways to access it through a ramp. So that's one type of a route. The photo below it is a gangway off to a tie-up facility. And although it's hard to see, there is a series of switchbacks. So it's two different applications of creating access to enhance that. The upper one where you see, or the upper right, that's a composting toilet. And although it's kind of hard to see, there is a pathway that has a polymer on it to make a hardened surface that goes into a ramp to provide that access to that composting restroom. And then below is a series of switch packs going from single car parking down to the beach. So these are some things that we have done and we have worked with to enhance the access to different amenities at facilities.
So Colleen sent a message in that she's saying the slides are not advancing. Can Can we confirm that before we move on?
Yeah.
So we're obviously seeing them in advance, but it sounds like board members might not be seeing them in advance. Sorry.
Not a problem.
Colleen, if you're there, are they advancing at all? Are they a little delayed or just not, or Laura, somebody, anybody?
They're not
I
advancing.
use the shared screen, but all I see is the first slide, the title slide.
Yeah, that's all I'm seeing also, it's just the title slide.
I used my iPod, I cheated. I looked at it.
I have to keep it on my iPad as well.
What's that?
They have it.
Okay.
But it's not working on the Teams at all. You just see the first slide.
Oh, but you're just looking at the one that was included in the packet.
Yeah, it's just the directorship of voting facilities accessibility, that's all. But again, I have it on my iPad, so I'm good.
And Craig, can you see the slides?
Like it said, all you can see is the first slide, you can't see the rest of it.
And can you get the slideshow on your iPad?
Well, I'm using my iPad for this.
What about that? Can folks see all of the slides on the left-hand side there if we go that way? Is that, let's try that. Can folks online on the Teams, can you see those slides now if we move through that way?
Laura, can you see that? Did it change?
Yeah,
Yes,
I can see it.
Okay, we're just gonna run it this way then, Craig, okay?
All right.
Do you want
sounds
to
good.
advance to the gangway, the next slide?
So we're on slide 4 on the gangways now. And Janine's gonna continue.
Okay, so voting has a lot of exemptions in code. And one of them is we're not required to go beyond an 80-foot gangway. And in many cases, that has seemed to be a barrier. So we have gone above and created a few different ways to reduce the slope at facilities. So the first slide is actually a series of 2 different gangways that will float and maintain the slope that we need to improve that access. And then the middle one has an extended transition plate to get past the light shading to make it easier for people coming off of the gangway. And that is beyond what we're required to do because it reduced the barrier, and that's what our goal was. And then the last one is a series of very long gangways. I think one of those is about 120 feet, and the other one's about 100 feet. And it was to reduce the barrier of having an extreme slope for boaters to be able to access the infrastructure and the upland amenities. So these are things we've done, even though we could comply by doing just an 80-foot gangway. In many cases, we go beyond that to reduce the barrier of having an extreme slope. The next one. So this is one, and Craig, you may remember this. Back in November of 2014, I was contacted by, well, actually contacted our program by Craig before he was a board member. And he identified that the docks were with no opening and the big 4x4 bull rails were very challenging for him to get in and out of his boat. And even though we met the requirements, we also view this as an opportunity to make a change. And Craig had some ideas, we had some ideas, and I looked, and we actually sent him 6 different concepts of how we could create an opening, how we could make this part of our standard. So we worked with Craig to identify where to place a gap. And so the lower left shows a dock underneath fabrication, and you can see 2 openings, and then you can see another view of that same set of openings in the upper middle. And so those are things that working with Craig, who at the time was just a boater who had a need, worked with us to enhance access. And it became part of our standards. So we integrated that into our design standards from 2014. And it's been used by a lot of boaters. They've commented on it and it's been highly supported. So that's just an example of things we have done. And it was a fairly easy process to make that. I think it ended up was like a $50 cost because of the additional welds to create the opening. So it was low cost, easy to do, and became part of our standards. So as docks and generation of fabrication materials have changed, we've also changed, always keeping in mind accessibility and the removal of barriers. So the upper left, you can see that the deck boards run in a very different way than they do now. Changing them actually improves the access. Older dock designs had belting, and in the heat or the cold, it would sometimes curl up. Facility folks would sometimes screw both sides down, and then we'd have binding at the hinge and creating a big lump. So through design, we have actually made the hinges, think of it as a tongue and groove or the interlock with a pin, and it is a very flat transition. It's also less maintenance, so it's the facility folks really like this idea because it's not as many pieces and components they're having to fight with, and it's a smooth transition on all of the docks. So those were things we did beyond what was required that were very easy things to incorporate to make things more accessible for all boaters. All right, the next one. So launches and slides. Slides are something that are popular with a lot of paddlers. And when I say something is accessible, there are always exemptions. So boat ramps by their nature have a slope, and those are exempted from the standard ADA requirements of what you would see on a sidewalk or a parking area. So your first photo actually shows where boaters were launching up and down that muddy, rutted bank. And we worked with a lot of different parties and boaters and fishing groups and installed a slide. Now, I chose this because there are some unique things that we enhance accessibility. So the top of the slide has a very gentle slope. It's compliant, it's flat. It allows a boater to get the boat staged on the rail system. And then there's handrails until ordinary high water. But if you notice on the lower picture, the steps, they're very wide. You see somebody kneeling on one, and you see somebody with both feet with plenty of room around them. So each of the steps is a landing platform, which enhances that access for people using the slide. This is something I would anticipate the board will see more of as we work with the paddlers, and we are hearing more requests about slides or rails. Definitely not this long, but similar types of structures. All right, so the next slide. Non-motorized access. So non-motorized kind of fits in this weird zone. The ADA guidelines for recreational boating are written very much towards a developed kind of motorized site. So the non-motorized kind of fits a little bit in there, but also a little bit into the outdoor recreation area. So we've been having some discussions with the Access Board over the last couple of years, trying to get some guidance on how to interpret some things. And we've also been talking to a lot of other states, vendors, trying to find ideas. So one of the concepts is some matting. And so the first two pictures left in the center on the top are different types of matting that could be seasonally installed to bridge gaps between a parking area and say a gravel bar to improve access. The matting is something that can roll up and be stored and then unrolled when you want to install it. So it's an idea that we're looking at to enhance that access. A lot of different dock designs, and that's going to come down to having a lot of discussion with users and facility owners on what type of boats. rafts have difficulty using some of these. Some of the dock designs are harder to use for wider boats or stand-up paddle boards. And so it's going to take a lot of discussion on what style of dock meets the uses that are there. And then we're also looking at some articulated block to improve access between an upper bench parking area and a gravel bar so that the incline slope is not as rutted up, damaged, repairing habitat as a way to semi-harden an area and create a more stable platform for people to transverse on it. So the lower set of photos where you have all the leaves, that's actually on the Sixes River. And that block has been installed for a very long time. And the Forest Service says it works very well in protecting that inclined area between an upper parking lot and the gravel bar that people are using to launch from. So these are some of the ideas we're talking about. Over the next few years, I expect to have a lot more conversations with users, with organizations to find more creative ideas on how to enhance access for paddlers. This is an exciting opportunity for us, and we're really looking forward to that. So it's a short and sweet presentation on the things we are doing that are generally beyond what is required. And of course, with everything that we are doing, we make sure we have handrails and slopes and all of the standard requirements. But we do like to go above and improve or reduce barriers for people. So does anybody have any questions? If not, I will let Dorothy get back up here and.
Hang on, let's go back to the full screen so I can see if anybody's got a hand up, please. Craig, you have your hand up.
Yeah, more of a comment than a question. The recreation standards were established in '88. Frankly, there wasn't a lot of time and effort put into it because they didn't really feel there was that many disabled people participating in voting. And those that did, they figured to be a passenger rather than owner or operator. So when we say we go above and beyond, well, that's really necessary to provide the access that people in wheelchairs or amputees really need. So I appreciate that we're doing that. There's still a lot of improvement to be had. So thanks, Janine, for what you do.
You're very welcome, and I look forward to finding more creative ways to reduce those barriers, Craig.
Anyone else have any questions? We will go back to Dorothy here momentarily. Thanks, Jenny. You're welcome.
Thank you. So I'll just offer a quick bit of history on electric motors in the context of ADA. Back in 2005, the board received a petition that requested that disabled boaters be allowed to use an electric motor on motor prohibited lakes if they had a disabled hunting and fishing permit from Fish and Wildlife. The board at that time denied the petition as submitted, but opened rulemaking kind of in response to it to look at whether there were any individual lakes that could be reconsidered where the rules could be changed to allow electric motors. So agency staff did a thorough evaluation of all of those possible lakes and proposed 3 lakes for electric motor use, and the board approved those. At that time, the number of lakes that the Marine Board had authority to change motor restrictions on was much smaller than it is today. As you all know, when HB 3168 was passed last year, that gave the Marine Board authority to allow electric motors on 21 lakes that previously could only be changed by the legislature. So the number of lakes you could consider now is greater than it was back then, but still the board found 3 lakes at that time, and decided to change the rules for those to allow electric motors on them. But the petition was denied, and so the petitioner was unsatisfied with that response and filed a complaint against the Marine Board through the U.S. Department of the Interior, alleging discrimination based on disability. In 2007, the Department of the Interior determined the board was not committing an act of discrimination against people with disabilities because when viewed in its entirety, the statewide voting program was deemed readily accessible to people with mobility challenges. Then in 2018, another complaint was filed along the same lines, alleging discrimination. And again, it was found the Marine Board was not engaging in discrimination. And in addition, they found that in both instances, the agency made a good faith effort to provide diverse voting opportunities throughout the state. So all that is to say that the conversation we're having today isn't based on any mandates or requirements. It's about exploring opportunities to enhance the voting experience for people with physical challenges on a proactive basis. And I think it makes a lot of sense for us to be having a conversation now in light of the increase in the number of lakes that the board has authority to change rules on to allow electric motors. Because a year ago, the non-motorized status of North and South Twin Lakes could only have been changed through an act of the legislature. So since the current rulemaking that we're in right now is a direct result of that Twin Lakes petition that you accepted in January, wanted to bring us back to those lakes to refresh everyone's memory on what those lakes are like. So Jennifer, if you can pull up the first slide. And then if you can go right to the next one. Okay, so this first slide here will give you a sense of where in the state these two lakes are located. They're in Deschutes County, with the nearest major town being Lapine. Both lakes are pretty close to Wickiup Reservoir, and then it's kind of zoomed in on the aerial photo there to the right. You can see they're labeled with their depth and acreage. That's information that was available to me, and so I went ahead and shared it just to give you a sense of the character of these lakes, if you're not already familiar with them. Go to the next slide. On this slide, you'll get a feel for the type of access that these two lakes offer to voters. There's one voting access facility at each lake, and those are managed by the Forest Service, and you would describe those as improved gravel ramps. But you can see they're pretty easily accessible by motor vehicle. You can imagine someone backing a trailer down there to launch many different types of boats. We can go to the next one too. So the lakes are very similar in a lot of respects, but South Twin is unique in that it has the Twin Lakes Resort. It's privately managed, has some of the amenities that you can see there on the slide. That's directly from their website. Understanding is that a lot of the guests at the resort are going to use both of those lakes as well as Wickiup Reservoir during their stay. And again, all that's just kind of to help paint a picture of this area and these lakes that that petition applied to. What the petitioner was requesting was that the board simply amend the rules to allow electric motors at slow to wake speed on North and South Twin Lakes. However, in explaining the reasons behind the proposed rule change, the author did state that the reason was to allow operators with limited mobility to access those lakes for fishing and recreation. And what the board did was accept the petition in open rulemaking, but to explore how an exemption could be made specifically for voters with physical challenges and disabilities, with one suggestion being that North and South Twin could maybe serve as a test case before expanding out to other lakes. So with that in mind, if we can go to the next slide, this provides just a real quick look at where most of the non-motorized lakes are clustered throughout the state. You can see that the majority of them are right there in the Cascade Mountain Range. Those green patches on there, those just indicate federally designated wilderness areas. Any waterway that's highlighted in purple indicates that motors are prohibited on that waterway. Rivers are not part of the discussion, but they're part of the map, so they're there. So anyway, there's a few non-motorized lakes scattered throughout the state, but they are kind of clustered there in a couple of counties in the Cascade Mountain Range. We often try to put waterways into categories. It's pretty helpful for analysis sometimes, but throughout this project, I've tried to be careful not to lose sight of the fact that a lake is very unique to the voter who loves that particular lake. So if an exemption to allow electric motors is something that the board would be interested in considering for other lakes, I think it's probably going to be pretty necessary to evaluate those on an individual basis. And just to put a plug in here for our interactive Boat Oregon map, if you're not already familiar with it, that's a really good place to start if you're not familiar with a certain lake or waterway. There's a lot of data and pictures and information in there. So that's linked in our website. It's also linked here in this presentation. So now my next slide is just an opportunity for discussion. That's all I prepared as far as an overview of some of the lakes that might end up being part of the discussion. So I don't know if you want to maybe give time for some questions before we launch into that discussion about exemptions.
Did anybody have some questions about the presentation thus far? Comments? Some kind of discussion?
No question about the presentation, but a question about what do we know of what other states are doing? Have other states faced this issue and how have they addressed it, if at all?
Sure. Member Moran, all I can tell you about that right now is that it was very difficult to research that question. And that was a question that I had, because it's always nice if somebody else has done it before you and you can learn from their mistakes and their successes. And I have not been able to identify any programs. I'm still very interested in knowing if there are such programs. But I feel like I did a pretty exhaustive search and I came up kind of empty-handed in that respect.
I've got a lot of friends who boat in Minnesota, you know, the land of 10,000 lakes. I actually looked into that also and did not have any success in finding any kind of a comprehensive program to address this at all. I thought if anybody was gonna have it, it was gonna be Minnesota, so.
Is this an open order?
Yes, yes, please.
Okay, so all the way, as for years, biggest concern that people have with opening up the electric motors is that you know there's going to be a rash of people that come on the lake because of that. I've never seen that to be the case in Waldo. We just approved it in Waldo. So I don't know what the impact of Waldo is, but again, I don't anticipate there's a lot of electric motors out there that can really impact the pristine nature of either of those lakes. On Twin Lakes, the comments were pretty negative about allowing motors on the lake because it would destroy the nature of the lake. I just can't see that. I don't think everybody's going to start buying electric motors so they can go out on Twin Lakes. There was a couple people in the comments that they're aging now and they no longer self-propellable. So they're wanting to still use Twin Lakes like they have in the past, the electric motor. I don't know if it has to be restricted to persons with disability. We just allow electric motors, and anybody who wants to buy electric motors can get on the lake. Still have no weight requirement. Electric motor is probably going to be no bigger than a 5 horsepower equivalent. So I would suggest maybe we look opening up to like Spokane to electric motors, trying to establish a program within the Marine Board to figure out how to issue disability permits to everybody. It's going to be challenging. State DMV, you know, they give tests, driving test to everybody that gets a driver's license, including people with disabilities. So if they know that they can properly operate a vehicle, even with a disability. I don't think the Marine Board's prepared to seek if a person who's disabled can safely operate a boat. And if they do, then we're treating those people differently. So I'm concerned about the program. I think the program is necessary. I'd like to see one. But I'm not sure how we administer it. We have to do it through doctor statements and what have you to ensure somebody who had a stroke is still capable to operate a boat safely. So we need to consider that. And then you had a couple other questions in your presentation that indicates a lot of challenges in the program. So I'd like to discuss some of those too, if you get an opportunity.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Vince.
I know that electric motors have a different rating, like it's not so much horsepower, it's more like thrust. And I haven't done the research, but do any of those rates that allow electric motors to do that limit to like extent horsepower or thrust?
No, go for it.
Member Castronova, so was he asking Randy?
No, he was asking.
I can jump in there too if you want. Yep, this is Randy. Pounds does not equate perfectly into, or pounds of thrust does not equate simply into horsepower. Remember that if we're looking at lakes related to the legislation that was passed last session, that there is a flow away requirement. So it wouldn't matter the size of the electric motor, there's still come with a flow away requirement. So that sort of takes that out. Now, historically, up until about 2003, we had thrust limitations on electric motors in some lakes, 38 pounds, 48 pounds, whatever. And the Marine Corps did away with those because they were just impossible to enforce. Sort of the idea that you don't tell somebody with a 300 horse car they can't go down the highway at 55. You just set the speed limit at 55. We are sort of at an interesting technological point though, where we're starting to see electric boats that can plane for extended periods. So it's something, if we're talking about a statewide program, it's certainly something we're going to need to be aware of because a lot of these electric motor lakes are, we're established with fishing, quiet activity. And if you were to start to see hydroplaning activity, we're going to hear about it.
Okay, thank you, Randy.
Craig, your hand's up. Did you have another comment or question? Okay.
Yeah, another comment. If we were to issue ordinance to establish who would be eligible for a permit once we determine that they do have a disability. And I would suggest to just have be the operator and owner of the boat rather than the passenger. DMV issues disability placards to family members who are disabled, whether they operate or own the vehicle. So we have to cautious about.
Thank you. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that either. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Vince.
So, listening to Craig talk about if you just open it up to electric motors to anybody, that's an okay idea, but I think you're gonna get a lot more people doing that, where I kind of like the idea of a doctor's note, a temporary permit or a permit for that person to operate. I think that's gonna keep the numbers down and maybe get compromise, between, so you don't have an overcrowding of electric motors out there, where it's just the people that really need it. That would be my suggestion. It's kind of, playing to both sides. Because if you just open up electric motors, you're gonna have a lot of people on that lake with electric motors. There could be a possibility of that.
Colleen?
What do you base that on, Vince?
I'm just as you open it up to more people, it's just a guess. It would make sense to open it up. Mm-hmm.
I think history shows that hasn't really changed the use of all of them.
And you could be right. I just say there's a potential of that. We just don't know.
Colleen?
I was just going to second the comment. I mean, I know we're not formally seconding anything, but
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, I do like the idea of a doctor's note. I think Greg brings up a good point. If we go ahead with this, we would need some way to determine eligibility, and just like a medical professional be a good one to provide that. Also seems to be in line with other state programs, like vaccinations come to mind in most other states, aside from Oregon. One does need a doctor's note if you want to be exempt from that.
So that's what DMV requires. that doctor's note only establishes that you're disabled. It doesn't establish that you can say, I slept at DMV to get the driver's test.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we're gonna kind of keep moving on here then. Dorothy has more information on the benefits for veterans with disabilities.
Well,
Yeah.
can I ask you a question
Oh,
before?
sure. Oh, yeah.
Member Whitney had said he had just some questions, I think, about just the overall administration or something.
Oh.
Did you get those out, Craig? Was this, before we move on to something new, I wanted to make sure, sorry. He
No,
mentioned
that's what I
something
thought.
about,
Well, there was a question about the numbers, and that's what we keep asking. We're not gonna know the numbers until we actually start the program. So, if you start at Twin Lakes or some other location, I disagree with them, so I don't think you're gonna see a lot of electric boat motors out there. So I don't think there's gonna be a real impact.
Yes.
Looking at my notes to see if I have anything else to. Oh, and then the defining disability, you speak about physical disabilities, but there's also mental disabilities. People may no longer have the cognitive skills, and they're considered disabled.
Right.
You have a person who has a stroke, and has difficulty speaking, or left side of his body is paralyzed, he still may be able to operate a vehicle or a boat through his good arm. So you have to keep that in mind. There's all kinds of disabilities out there. And someone's going to have to evaluate whether they're capable of operating a boat, protect themselves and protect others. And DMV does that through the driving test. I'm not sure how we would do it.
Well, you bring up a good point with that, Craig, because in some of the questions that Dorothy posed in here, you know, what would be the duration of a short-term permit versus a long-term permit renewals? That kind of all plays into what you're talking about right there, because if somebody has a disability, maybe due to an accident or something, and they have a doctor's note, how long do we issue a permit for? And then how do they go about renewing? So they're all very pertinent questions. I don't know that we're going to be able to come up with the answers until we start somewhere.
Sure. So I would just like to mention that the only program that I could locate in my research that seemed somewhat comparable to the situation that we're facing happens to be in Oregon with the Oregon Disabilities Hunting and Fishing Permit. And as I had suggested before, I don't know that it is something where if you possess that permit, that should then qualify you for a Marine Board permit to operate an electric motor. But I think the framework is pretty simple and makes a lot of sense. And ODFW has basically come up with their own definition of disability as it relates directly to hunting and fishing. So, for instance, you know, the doctor would say that you have, you know, a permanent physical impairment that prevents you from holding or shooting a firearm or bow. So that wouldn't translate directly to whether you can manually propel a boat or not. But it does get at the specific physical challenges that affect someone's ability to boat. Since, you know, the purpose of this conversation is to talk about, you know, opportunities for boaters with disabilities to still be able to get out onto their favorite lake and use that resource, you know, that maybe they can't anymore, whether it's due to, you know, a challenge they were born with, a challenge they acquired, an accident that leads to maybe just a temporary impairment or a permanent impairment. When I kind of pictured what this could look like, I did happen to picture it getting a little bit more specific than simply, you know, a doctor affirming that you have a disability. I pictured it being pretty specific to a boating activity. So I wanted to insert that real quick in my mind.
Comment? You look like you're getting ready to say something, Craig.
Well, that would make it a process. The doctor's really not ready or equipped to evaluate whether the person with a disability can do different things. Because each disability is reflected differently in an individual. So, what he can tell you what the injury is, what the injury is at, whether they have ability to lift their arms or something like that. But we'll ask you another way to evaluate how they can perform different tasks. If you want them to do an extensive analysis and represent to you that they're capable of safely operating a boat, that's an area that I'm not sure a doctor would wander into. There's a liability to go along with that. You can start giving tests, you can have them drive a boat for you, do different things. That be treating them differently than the rest of the public.
Discrimination.
Simple to go there.
I,
The simple solution is to allow electric boats on the lakes that people can utilize, whether it's disabled or not.
Okay, so one of the questions in my write-up for the meeting is if lakes were to be considered on an individual basis, what factors would influence whether a lake was included in this program? And I know that Randy Henry was involved in an extensive evaluation of lakes that were motor prohibited several years ago. And as we talked about before, HB 3168 has changed the game a little bit in that the board now has the authority to change restrictions on many more lakes than it did in the past. So it makes sense that we would look at those now that we have the opportunity. But I'm curious if there's, any discussion on what, how would a lake qualify to be opened up to electric motors, or would it just be every lake that the board has authority over?
I have a question.
oh, go ahead, Vince.
So, do we have any information, or study or something on how disruptive electric motors are? Because to me, I haven't really had much exposure with them. So, but I've heard that they're very little, and especially if you're 5 miles, or less. Paddling, if you've ever seen me paddleboard, I'm like all over it. So I think I'm more disruptive than electric motors. I just didn't know if there's any studies out there,
So, Member Castronovo, I'm not aware of any studies, but I have heard from several boaters recently, because this honestly comes up, somewhat regularly, not as a discussion about boaters with disabilities, but we get calls from folks who, thought they could use an electric motor on this one lake. They got there, somebody yelled at them, they wanted to get some clarification on the rules. And so I do have the opportunity to hear some opinions from people. And it's another one of those where, people who find electric motors to be disruptive tell me that they're very disruptive, that they don't like the sound. They don't, there are plenty of other lakes where electric motors are allowed. Let's keep some lakes that, it's paddling only. And then I hear from other folks that, electric motors are practically silent. If you're going at slow, no wake speed anyway, they're no more disruptive than somebody paddling. So I've heard a lot of different opinions about it, but as far as being able to, tell you factually whether, they're disruptive or annoying, I probably can do that.
Because really, that's what the crux of the argument is. Are they disruptive or aren't they? And if they're not really disruptive, I don't see where there'd be a problem. But anybody else?
Well, we're gonna, Director Warren is gonna chime in here.
So I think what Dorothy was getting at is really probably where the discussion's heading, listening in, which is, are there bookends to some of this? So I think it's hard to imagine that we would just open up every lake in the state of Oregon to electric that's not open now, I think there would be some pretty significant political interest in that kind of decision. I think there's some areas where people really hold on, but I also think, you know, in listening to Member Withy, it's very consistent with what the governor's office tells us, which is oftentimes when we do something that's good for folks with disabilities, it's actually good for everybody. So do we look at some of these lakes and start to look at criteria? For instance, South Twin Lake, where, you know, it wouldn't necessarily be something a lot of folks would consider to be a super pristine lake like a Hosmer or something like that. But I know with that said, there's folks that feel pretty passionate about the Twin Lakes as well. But I think that bookend discussion where if the board could, you know, between now and tomorrow, sort of in your minds, that really helps staff think about how to frame some of the solutions.
And I think that what we really need to look at right now is, you know, this is a broader discussion. I mean, we're not gonna solve the issue for all of the lakes in the state at this time. I think we're just trying to come up with a framework so that when we can move forward on that, we'll deal with the South Twin Lakes tomorrow and that petition in particular. And maybe that's how we're gonna deal with the rest of the lakes. That's just gonna have to be the part of the bookend discussion that we need to come up with. Like everybody else saw in the comments, we did see an awful lot of comments that ran the gamut, even for North-South Twin Lakes, as to, you know, yes, no, we want them, we don't want them. So, and I think that we need to consider that in looking at our framework of how we're going to apply electric motor use for people with disabilities in the future.
Sure.
Dick, we're gonna go back to Dorothy here.
So just kind of anecdotally, Josh and I were talking about this morning about Gold Lake and how that was one of those in that bill that gave the Marine Board authority to change the restriction. And so as a result of the petition, the board did adopt rules to allow electric motors at slow no-wake speed on Gold Lake. And Josh let me know that he's received one phone call since then from someone who didn't know about the rule change, and so they were surprised and confused to see somebody out there with an electric motor. And so he explained the rule process and how that came to be, and I think they were fairly satisfied with that. And just because we're not getting a whole bunch of phone calls about something doesn't mean it's not happening. But just to let you know, we haven't gotten a lot of calls saying, hey, there are suddenly all these electric motors on Gold Lake before when there weren't. And in some cases, just the location of a lake, the facilities, you know, how big the parking lot is, some of that can kind of constrict how many people can really operate on that lake at a given time anyway. So I can't say that allowing electric motors does not greatly increase the use. I know that's a fear that a lot of people have, but I just thought that little anecdote might be somewhat revealing, and we could certainly monitor that over time to see if the use on a lake like Gold Lake does increase when you allow electric motors.
Randy, are you wanting to chime in there?
Oh, I'm sorry, I was just wiggling.
Okay.
There's probably a lot of stuff I want to say, but I'm not going to. So Dorothy's doing a great job.
Okay.
I think one, just so I don't create any confusion for folks listening, Hosmer actually allows electrics already. My apologies for that. But it's just another piece to keep in mind, like you mentioned, Wallow Lake. You know, some of these lakes that are non-motorized now sit in like federal lands and whatnot, and sometimes our partners there have some really strong feelings about some of those lakes. And so it just, again, as you think about how to help staff figure out where the board's at in terms of how you want to go forward on this issue, just thinking about all those pieces and factors.
That's a long list.
Yeah. We think about it all the time, so.
Go ahead, Craig.
I'd like to ask one question. You see how this can be managed? You said you would depend upon the doctor's statement to determine if somebody qualified. You have a checklist that a doctor would go through?
Member Withy, I think, that's one option that you could consider to determine if someone qualifies. I know we talked about some other options, of relying on an existing permit that somebody may already have. I don't know that I would advocate for any of those options. So yeah, I probably would sort of lean toward a checklist for a person's doctor, very similar to what the ODFW disabled hunting and fishing permit requires. It's a fairly simple application process. I happen to have a family practice doctor in my family, and I asked him, how do you and your colleagues feel about, signing off on these types of things and filling out forms? And he revealed that they do fill out a lot of forms, and they do get a lot of requests from people to, verify that their patient qualifies for something. But, he said if it was pretty simple, it wouldn't take them too much time, and that's something that they're very used to doing, because there are quite a few programs that require verification from a doctor. So I think that the hard task would be coming up with that list and that description of ailments that may impede somebody's ability to manually propel their boat.
Laura?
And then, once you come up with that list, you have to be prepared for the backlash with people you say aren't eligible.
Absolutely.
And if we could avoid all that, we could pull out of their authority. Correct?
Laura, you have a comment?
Well, comment question for Dorothy. I'm kind of thinking about this thing from a different angle. Do we know how many FTEs or hours of labor or cost of labor hunting and fishing license costs to administer? I'm looking at, we're talking about decreased revenue within our agency. Granted, doing lake by lake petition requests has a financial impact. Just seeing the trade-off of kind of trying to develop and then implement an individual disability permit program.
Yeah, Member Jackson, I apologize for not having that information at the meeting. That would have been helpful. I don't know how many FTE. I think Director Warren might be able to chime in here though.
I was told, so we always talk ahead of time and try to guess your questions, and I was told I was supposed to be ready to answer that one. That is certainly a concern that we have from the staff side. We really don't have anybody sitting around with nothing to do. And so depending on how complex the program got, that would be a concern. We would have to carve some work up somewhere, stop doing something. Now, again, ways around that would be to, kind of do the petition as a lake by lake is one. There is certainly work involved with that. Depends on how many we get, and that's tough to predict. And then, there could be a longer term to try to work with, if we really wanted to get a really complicated program, that's probably something we would need to long-term work with the legislators and find some staffing and budget for. But the workload is a concern for staff if we get very complicated on a program that takes a lot of administration and forms and storage and determinations. And, as Member Withy mentioned, if you had to go to the point of having somebody out on the water trying to do tests, I mean, that's just, and that was not what he was suggesting. I understood that, but just.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing that I'm concerned about too is the money that would need to go to enforcement if we did open everything up to slow no wake. With electric motors, still slow no wake, because electric motors can go faster than slow no wake. And so then, we'd be looking at potential impact on law enforcement again. Complaints.
So if we were to implement a program, I would think we could do it in conjunction with the voter registration. So when we issue a permit, we do it with voter registration, and they'd have to redo it every time they renew their registration. Hopefully that would cut some of the cost. Did I stun everybody?
No, just, we're all writing down. We're all writing it down, Craig.
And again, I think it's just the complexity, your point there, remember with you, is a good one. But then you point out some of if it was as easy as, if you have a DMV, then yes, and in a way, that's a lot easier. But you pointed out some of it's the circle we get ourselves into, is there's shortcomings with that model. You pointed out some we didn't even think about. If we go with the fish and wildlife, well, now not everybody fishes, and that's a problem. Sending the doctors know, as you pointed out, maybe the doctor isn't the best one to always decide whether somebody is capable of driving. And then there's different levels of driving boats. I mean, so how does the doctor decide, so there's, it's certainly an area I think we want to make sure we're doing our best to serve the disabled community and grow that ability for disabled voters to participate. And it's a circle conversation we get into too. So we were hoping y'all would sort it out and make it a straight line. So.
We're making it more jagged, they're saying. Laura, you still have your hand up. You want to make another comment?
Nope, I forgot to take it down.
Okay. All right. I think Dorothy, does anybody else have something to add on this? Because she had one more point here to talk about too, with the disabled veterans and the Marine Board. Dorothy, did you have something else you wanted to ask the board about on the rest of it?
Not right at this time. Maybe in the conversation about disabled veterans, it might bring up some more.
I think she's moving on.
We're moving on. Okay, good.
I'd like to comment on disabled veterans. I think it'd be nice if the board could find a way to sponsor different programs for encouraging disabled veterans to participate in voting activities. I'm not sure what that looks like. But somebody coming back from a war zone has PTSD or depression or something, it'd be nice if the board was able to have a program that helps them get involved and participate in voting. So if somebody has an idea of how to do that, I would like to encourage them to bring it forward.
Well, actually, I participated in programs like that quite a bit because through the guide community, we've done a lot of programs with returning vets. We've done, take a vet fishing. We've also done Wounded Heroes. We've done all kinds of different programs that have helped to get those people onto the water, to get the people who served our country onto the water at some point, to be able to introduce them either to fishing or just boating in general or any type of water activity. I think that might be some kind of a program that could be encouraged at some point. Just to, we would get sponsorship. When we did the ones in Alaska, we actually had the backing from Alaska State Parks and also just through the larger guide communities up there. And same down here, where we've done some of those programs, not necessarily through the Marine Board, but through larger guide organizations.
Okay. So I just wanted to say the reason why this topic was kind of tacked onto this discussion is we sort of felt it was appropriate since we were already talking about voters with physical challenges and disabilities. And then while we were kind of researching this topic, we were approached by a voter who is a disabled veteran, and he had just learned about the waterway access permit, and he was actually pretty surprised to find that his disabled veteran status did not exempt him from that or provide some type of discount for that. Because veterans are encouraged by the Oregon Department of Veterans Affairs to check and see if there's any exemptions or discounts before they buy any type of a recreation pass. Because the state of Oregon has a couple of programs and the federal government has a few programs also. But Jennifer, if you wouldn't mind pulling up probably my very last slide. So the topic comes up from time to time where, people call in and they ask if there's any type of a discount or exemption for veterans. And so far, The Marine Board doesn't have anything that directly reaches out to that group. So I just found out a little bit of information about some other state recreation programs that do. And so there's the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department, Special Access Pass. And then the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife has a free combination license, hunting and fishing for veterans with at least a 25% service-connected disability. And just for your information, I learned that in Oregon Parks and Recreation, approximately 8,000 people a year apply for that special access pass, and about 33,000 people have a current pass that they hold. So it seems reasonable that, you know, with boating being a recreational activity, there may be some overlap between people who are using parks and people who want to get out in their boats. So I thought that little bit of information might be slightly helpful. But the purpose of me sharing all of this with you today is basically just to inform you that there's interest from the public in some type of benefit program for veterans or disabled veterans. And so wanted to find out if the board is interested basically in, you know, exploring this topic further.
Well, would that have to go through the legislature since all of ours are fee-based, or do we have some leniency on some of those
So
programs?
as far as the waterway access permit, which is what this gentleman approached me about, Senate Bill 47 is the legislation that established the fund and permit and the fees. The Marine Board doesn't have authority to give discounts on fees or exempt anyone from fees, but it does have the authority, in this instance at least, to create exemptions from the requirement to obtain the permit at all. So that would probably be the board's option on the waterway access permit in particular, would be that, you know, this group here is exempted from having to carry that permit.
Okay. So can we go back to the
Oh, yeah.
so I can see?
Yeah.
Okay. So questions or comments? Go ahead.
I was gonna say, one thought there, member Whitney had mentioned, how could we help, you know, with some of the disabled vets, and I was thinking of a particular organization that I've heard the founder guest speak on. I was searching for it and found there's actually quite a few pretty formalized looking nonprofit programs in the state that help support disabled vets. So perhaps one thing we could do is just start to reach out to some of those and ask if they would like us to somehow, you know, acknowledge that they exist, and we could start helping, you know, link off to their sites, disabled vets, here's some things you could look at. That might be one way we could help serve that disabled veterans community. Is just, again, I couldn't even find the one that I'm thinking of yet because there were so many doing some good work. So that might be an area where we could help.
Public outreach.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, could we sponsor the Disabled Vets Day and put them on a charter? So, yeah, working.
Actually, several of the charter boats down there do offer that availability, so.
Yeah, it might be a good, just to start to try to learn about some of those, because there are, I know, quite a few.
There's a lot of organizations throughout the state that work with disabled vets and offer a free fishing day, or, you know, basically, you know, take a vet fishing, or take, you know, beyond wounded warriors type things. So, I mean, that.
You know, that's what they did in Seward. You're talking about Alaska. They had a Wounded Warriors Day, and that was the day that the vets went out with all the charter boats.
Right. That was one of the programs that they did there. So, Laura?
I was gonna say, I believe one of the Dragon Boat clubs in Portland sponsors a disabled vet squad.
Oh.
If it's not one of the clubs, then it's one of the Rose Festival teams. And there's also within the rowing community, maybe not here in Oregon, but I know up in Washington, they've partnered with the VA or the State Veterans Office. There's also a good friend of mine, who's a medicine specialist, actually got a grant from the VA to do a veteran disabled program as a way to help improve physical health as well as mental health amongst people who were recently wounded. So I think there's a lot of stuff out there that's kind of hidden, and would be fun to figure out how we can promote it better as a voting agency.
Yeah, that public outreach would be really important to link those types of organizations, just because it is very difficult to find them. You know, it's hard to know what all programs there are throughout the state, and
Exactly.
mhm. That's awesome. More work for Ashley. Okay.
Chair Early, I just wanted to mention real quick, I remember now that one of the reasons why this particular gentleman who was talking to me, and he educated me pretty well on, you know, programs that he's eligible, people he knows are eligible for, and how they help in different ways. And one of the reasons why some disabled veterans may want an exemption from the requirement to carry a specific permit is, in many cases, they can't predict, you know, when their high functioning days might be, or how many of those they'll get in a certain time period. And so sometimes they hesitate to put out the money to buy a permit for a whole year or 2 years or whatever, you know, recreation program they might be trying to access, not having any idea how often they will actually be able to utilize that given whatever disabilities they're facing. So I just felt like I should share that in case that informs the discussion at all. And I do think that based on talking with him and talking with some other folks, if the board doesn't, you know, have an interest in trying to, you know, accommodate an exemption for waterway access permits, you know, there may be a petition forthcoming at some point. So, you know, it's just probably something that isn't going to stop being talked about.
Well, just a point, we do have a petition that we're hearing tomorrow regarding the waterway access permit and the fees. And so if we decided to open up rulemaking, that might be an opportunity to also address this issue at that time. Right?
Where is that the case?
It would depend on how you opened them, Chair Early.
Yes,
Oh,
I said opportunity.
Josh is chiming in.
Hi, Chair and members of the board. You could technically accept the petition and open up the rulemaking and include the component of this conversation. However, that is, from our guidance from the Secretary of State's office, that is strongly discouraged.
Okay.
So you could still accept the petition and address what the petitioners wanted you to do. But I would advise, if you were going to engage on this conversation, to do that through a separate manner.
Separate rulemaking? Okay. Well, thank you for that clarification.
And there will be an opportunity, correct me if I'm wrong, but you have a couple opportunities tomorrow to direct staff to propose rules or to open a new rulemaking. You can do that at any time.
Right,
So,
we can.
sure, so that's something that you could consider for tomorrow.
So we could be proactive versus waiting for the petition.
Sure.
Any additional comments or questions for Dorothy? Okay, well, if there is nothing else, then that really is the end of our work session today. Does anybody else have anything else any comments regarding what we've heard today during our work sessions that you would like to throw in there? Well, seeing as that there is none, then we'll close our work session and resume at our, oh, go ahead, Laura, sorry.
Totally different topic, but I just want to thank Dorothy. I just want to thank Dorothy for her help on the derelict vessel issue that I brought up with her.
You're very welcome.
Awesome. Okay, so we will resume tomorrow morning for our board meeting, and everybody have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.